Good evening. Hope you all had a great and restful day today. Maybe some of you got naps and some of you just hung out and relaxed and enjoyed a lunch. And here we are again. Thank you, Jack, for those wonderful songs. Some of those songs I don't know if I've ever sang before, and they're nice. So now we have. So good songs. You know, there are many things in this life that we could look at that are negotiable. When you think about in real estate, when you go list your home, that is not written in stone, the price. The price of that home can be negotiated. If you're going to list an item on eBay, eBay has uh, many items on it. If you go and you find those items, the seller will actually negotiate with you. It'll say to make an offer, and you can make a lower offer. They can accept it, or they could counter back to you, just like in real estate, how you could have counter offers going back. But when we think about it, there's many things that can be negotiated in business and sports. Contracts are negotiable, and they can be negotiated. Now, when it comes to faith, there are many who compromise their faith. They may take the easy road. They are not grounded in their faith, and there are many others who may be forced to do so. It doesn't make it right, but maybe family pressure them to compromise their faith, or maybe it could be a job, an occupation that causes somebody to negotiate their faith, so to speak. Maybe it's out of inconvenience, something that it's just so inconvenient to go, to church. It's so inconvenient to be always with a church family. I got this to do, I got this to do. Our faith must never, ever be negotiated. The truth of God has come down from heaven. It's written on the tablets of the heart by the Holy Spirit. In Proverbs chapter 23 and verse 23, the proverb writer says, "Buy the truth and sell it not." You could buy anything and sell it if you want, but never have that truth that you have bought in your heart, that you have read and studied, and sell that truth. It's far too important to do so. Daniel, and we're going to be in the book of Daniel, and Daniel's faith was tried and his faith was tested. He was put in inconvenient and compromising situations. He worked in a land that was hostile to his faith and also his loyalty to God. Think about it. When he was young, basically, he was kidnapped. He was thrown into exile, into Babylonian captivity, where he was threatened to be killed by the king if he did not interpret his dream. However, Daniel's faith was non-negotiable because he knew that God was the one who was in control. See, when we live our lives knowing that God is in control, then we are going to be okay when certain things come our way that could compromise our faith. We will not allow them to. Tonight, we're going to begin just a short series on the book of Daniel, and the theme is going to be God is in control. We're going to look at three characteristics that Daniel showed that he had non-negotiable faith. First of all, the first characteristic that showed that his faith was uncompromising was Daniel made godly decisions. He made a godly decision to keep himself pure. Look at the first chapter in the book of Daniel and look it down in verse 8. And verse 8 states this: "But Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the king's choice food or the wine which he drank, so he sought permission from the commander of the officials that he might not defile himself." And we think about that on the surface, Daniel was really in a tough spot here. How is Daniel not going to defile himself and also not, not offend the king? Think about that. Imagine if you were in the presence of someone very prominent. Let's say you were in the presence of the governor. You were asked to go to a governor's dinner, let's say. And I'm not talking about like if you don't like the governor. I'm just saying you're invited to the governor's house and you're invited to this feast and you're given something to eat and drink, but that violated your conscience. How are you going to react? Are you going to turn that down? Are you going to say, I can't offend I'm not going to offend him, so I'm just going to go along with it. See, that was not Daniel. See, Daniel made a godly decision. He did not defile himself. He chose not to do that. See, it was a choice, wasn't it? He could have chose to do otherwise, but he chose not to do that. Sometimes we may get into similar situations where we're going to need to make a decision. But when we think about that, the decision, as we look at this text in our lives, it's really simple, isn't it? Think about it. If it's a sinful act, then we don't do it. No matter what. We turn it down. It doesn't matter if we offend. We could turn it down politely, can't we? Think about this. When you're ever in that situation, would you rather offend God? Who are you going to offend? Someone out there, or are you going to offend God? I would rather offend someone else. Not that saying we're trying to go out and offend others. Not saying that. Sometimes you just can't help it. But if you do it in a polite, loving way, we're going to look at how Daniel was with this. Daniel made godly decisions. Are we making godly decisions to be right in God's sight? Are we being like Daniel and we're living and we're making those decisions so we could please our Father in heaven? Now let's look at the second characteristic that shows Daniel's uncompromising faith, his non-negotiable faith. And Daniel showed discernment. He showed discernment. And this is going to be in chapter 2. When we look at Daniel's wisdom and we look at his judgment on situations, it was not only to save himself. He was thinking about others. He was doing so to save others. Looking in chapter 2, Daniel pleads with the king to save the wise men. See, the king called the wise men to interpret a dream. We see this in the first 3 verses. And we see in this text here, in this chapter here, we see that Chaldeans asked for them to interpret the king's dream. Now, if they failed, they'd be put to death. Think about that. You either are successful and you'll have that great honor will be rewarded to you, verses 5 and 6. But if you're not successful, if you cannot do it, you're going to be put to death. And see, we look at this and we see there's a big problem with the wise men here because they were digging them. So they dug themselves into a deep trouble here, into a deep hole. They stalled, and then the king knows they're stalling here. They tell the king nobody can tell of his dream interpretation, verses 7 and through 11 of chapter 2. And King Nebuchadnezzar is furious. He's furious. And he puts out this decree to put them to death, verses 12 and 13. Now look at Daniel. Daniel was concerned about others. He was concerned about these wise men. Look at chapter 2 and verse 14 and through 18. It states, then Daniel replied with, look at this, discretion and discernment to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, who had gone forth to slay the wise men of Babylon. He answered and said to Arioch, the king's commander, for what reason is the decree from the king so urgent? Then Arioch informed Daniel about the matter. Verse 16, so Daniel went in and requested of the king that he would give him time in order that he might declare the interpretation to the king. Then Daniel went to his house and informed his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. This was their Babylonian names given to them. This was their Jewish names. And so in order that they might request compassion from God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his friends might what? Might not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men in Babylon. See, Daniel uses, it says that he used discretion and he used discernment talking to Arioch. Arioch was the captain of the king's bodyguard who was going to kill these wise men. And then Daniel has this plea. Look at the plea in verse 24. Then Daniel went to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to execute the wise men of Babylon, and said to him, do not execute the wise men of Babylon. Take me to the king, and I will interpret his dream for him. See, we need to be like Daniel, and we need to practice this type of discernment, this type of discretion on behalf of others, not just for ourselves, but also to save, to help others. That's a great lesson for us from the book of Daniel. Now let's look at the third characteristic of Daniel that showed his uncompromising faith, his non-negotiable faith. And Daniel was fully devoted to God. See, Daniel did serve the king here, but he served God first and foremost. God was always first to Daniel. He was the most important thing to Daniel. We see that in his actions and how he lived. We see that in Daniel chapter 2 and verse 31 through 45. And he goes to the king Nebuchadnezzar and he interprets his dream. And then we get into chapter 3 and we see that dream unfolding. Daniel gets promoted, and King Nebuchadnezzar recognizes Daniel's God. That's the one amazing thing. Another amazing, there's many amazing things when we go through the book of Daniel, but he recognizes his God, his power. He sees that. Look at verses 46 and 48, chapter 2. Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face and did what? Did homage to Daniel and gave orders to present to him an offering and fragrant incense. The king answered Daniel and said, "Surely your God is a God of gods and a Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, since you have been able to reveal this mystery." Then the king promoted Daniel and gave him many great gifts, and he made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief prefect over all the wise men of Babylon. Yes, Daniel appoints 3 of his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, over the administration of the province of Babylon. What did this do? How were the Chaldeans with this? How did they react to this? See, they were jealous, the text tells us. They were very angry that Daniel would do such a thing. And we look at King Nebuchadnezzar makes a large image of gold as we get into chapter 3. And when we look at the measurements of this and this big, huge image, this big, huge statue of gold was 95 feet tall. And you can think about how tall that is, and almost 10 feet wide, 9.5 feet wide. I mean, this thing was enormous. And what was his decree? Do you remember what his decree was? His decree was for them to bow down and worship this idol. That decree meant if they didn't, they would be put to death. That's right. They die. They die. Imagine having that today in front of us. We don't worship, we don't denounce Christ and worship an idol, and we die. What would we do? The Chaldeans brought charges against these Jews, reminding the king that if anyone does not obey his command to do this, his decree to do that, they needed to be put to death. They needed to be thrown into the fiery furnace, verses 8 through 12. And Daniel and his friends would not do so. They would not bow down to this false idol, this pagan idol. And he was furious. Nebuchadnezzar orders Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to be cast into this fiery furnace. And you remember what happens. You know, this is a very popular story, right? We look at chapter 3 and verse 23 through 25, and we see that they are thrown into this furnace, and Nebuchadnezzar was astounded, right? Because he looks and he sees not only 3 who are now unbound, they're walking in that furnace. He sees a 4th one. Who was that 4th one that he's seen? Angel, the Lord. Say it's Jesus, most likely there, walking with them, saving them, sent from heaven, saving them from Nebuchadnezzar. The fire could not touch them. Yeah, the world will look at that and say, no way. That defies science. That defies physics. But they're not looking at the power of God. God's the one that protected them. We see this in this chapter 3, verse 23 through 25. But look at 26 and verse 27. It says, Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the furnace of blazing fire, responded and said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, come out, you servants of the Most High God. You servants of the Most High God. And he says, come here. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the midst of the fire. Verse 27, the satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the king's high officials gathered around and saw in regard to these men that the fire had no effect on the bodies of these men, nor was the hair of their head singed, nor were their trousers damaged, nor had the smell of fire even came upon them. See, God saved them because they were like Daniel. They had the influence. We talked about influence this morning, and Daniel influenced them and showed them his dedication to God, and they were dedicated to God. They refused to bow to this king's large idol. When we think about that, how does that apply to us? Isn't that a great lesson for us today? Because each and every one of us, we face fiery furnaces, basically, in many ways in this world that we have to look at. We're persecuted in certain ways. We're looked at differently than the rest of the world because we're Christians. We just because we're Christians does not mean that we're not going to go through trials and tribulations, and we face them, don't we? Yet we know if we refuse to sin, refuse to give in to sin, and dedicate ourselves to God, we refuse to serve idols. There's many idols out there that we could serve. We refuse to serve them, and we only follow God. We know that God is going to deliver us. We have that promise, don't we? See, Daniel's integrity and his faith, that was not going to be negotiated. It was not up for sale. It was uncompromising. It was non-negotiable. He made godly decisions in his life, and he kept himself pure. He served his fellow man, not just himself. He put others before himself. He put himself in danger. But he used discernment. He was non-confrontational when he went in front of the king. He used wise judgment when he served others. We need to be the same. See, Daniel's devotion to God was non-negotiable. Is your devotion to God negotiable? Can someone get you away from your God? There's many ways in which they can, and you need to discern. You need to look to see, is something sinful? I'm not going to do it. It goes against what God wants me to do. I'm not going to do it. See, Daniel's faith helped his friends. It helped them to be devoted to God. He had that influence over them. You have that influence over people in your lives. Let's all walk with non-negotiable faith. And when we think about who's in charge, who is in control, I'm not saying it's going to be easy all the time, but it becomes much more easier when we trust in Him. When we know that God, we got to give it to Him. You know, don't we take so much on our shoulders? You know, I know I do. Well, why? Why do we do that when we have Him? The lesson is yours tonight. Let's walk in non-negotiable faith. If you need to answer the invitation tonight, and if you're ready to give yourself to Jesus tonight, do so right now. Do not wait until later. Tonight is the night of salvation. Come as we stand and we sing God's invitation song.